Hello, everyone. Today is August 21st, 2024. This is another episode of the In a Nutshell podcast. I'm your host, Sean Vowells. With me is Joe Meade. And today, Joe and I are going to go over the old Big Ten East teams and then two of the four new teams. Now, 18 teams is far too much for me and Joe to get to in just one episode, so we'll do the rest of them tomorrow. But Joe, no more divisions in the Big Ten. We got some new teams. We got a 12-team college football playoff. A whole lot different of a landscape in college football this time around.
Sean, I don't think there's been anything like this in American sports in a while. Maybe if you're an MLS fan in terms of all the expansion teams, but these are all teams that people are familiar with. And I say familiar with very hesitantly because when you change conferences, when you expand the way you do, core identities programs are often tested. So these are uncharted waters, and a lot of this preview is based on players, it's based on predictions, it's based on a lot of past history, because speculating the future, and just for an example, anyone in 2020 during the pandemic couldn't have projected where we'd be in 2024 with all these conference teams. So
Joe, let's get into it. We're going to go through the schedule and maybe some lingering questions that the teams will have as the season takes form. So, Joe, we're going to throw us up in the top right here for those listening on or watching on YouTube, and we're going to throw up the first team, and that is going to be the Indiana Hoosiers. Year one for former James Madison coach Curt Cignetti. The typical basketball school had a couple years of success there under Coach Allen, but the bottom really fell out from underneath them, Joe. Before we get into the schedule, what do you think about Curt Cignetti leading the Hoosiers?
I think ultimately, if you look at the popcorn value in terms of the welcome speech he had at the basketball game, which we referenced in a lot of last year's podcast toward the end of December, I think he got the fan base on board. And I'm not saying that means Hoosier Stadium's going to be packed every game. But what I can tell you is he's not backing down. He's not someone who's seems to be interested in patience, which is something a lot of fans now appreciate more than ever, because pre-NIL and pre-transfer portal, fans were willing to put up with it. And I think at a school like Indiana, they still are. But hey, being good early and meeting expectations earlier, I've never once met a fan who's ever been angry about that.
So we've got the schedule up there for those watching. Those listening, you're just going to have to pull one up and follow along with us. The non-conference games, Joe, are all at home. They are all against low to mid majors. If Indiana trips up in any of these, major alarm bells.
I wouldn't say necessarily for the program's overall picture, but I think this year, and I know this will be the follow-up, and what we're going to do with every team is what's going to define success. I think being bowl eligible is a very clear goal for this team. I don't think Cignetti at media day even shied away from that. I think based on what you add, and Curtis Rourke, the quarterback from Ohio, Justice Ellison from Wake Forest, and Kalen Black from James Madison. These are guys Kalen Black being somebody coached, these are guys Cignetti brought in because he's not going to play around. These are guys that, especially Rourke, a fifth-year senior, you're not bringing a fifth-year senior in to necessarily build the program for the long term. He's not a project. He's someone who's going to come in, and the only project of Cignetti is getting momentum right off the chart. Because at this rate, Sean, at Indiana, I want you to testify to this after I'm done. You can't sell that the crowd's going to be into it. You can't sell past championships. The only thing Cignetti can sell going into recruits' houses now is the results on the field.
Yeah, so clearly I think you got to get the three games, Florida International, Western Illinois, and Charlotte. For any chance of getting to bowl eligibility, you can't trip up in any of those. Now, the Big Ten schedule is somewhat difficult, I would say. You have the Washington, you have Michigan, you have Ohio State. But other than that, Joe, a number of teams that should be in what is a crowded middle of the pack here in the Big Ten. You've got UCLA on the road as your first Big Ten game. That'll be the NBC 7:30 p.m. kickoff. But I don't know if a super easy Big Ten stretch comes at you here, but also, a month plus of losing should also be avoided here. You've got a number of good teams there at the end of the schedule, but looking at the schedule, what we know now, there should be at least a possibility that this team can get 6 or 7 wins.
I completely agree, Sean. And I think a lot of people are going to write off the at UCLA as an immediate loss. As we'll get into tomorrow with UCLA, I don't think that's a team that should be as feared as everyone says. Clearly, UCLA, the brand, is unmatched, but their football team, I think, is going to struggle a lot this year. And there's a lot of games on their schedule that look like if you just penciled in typical Indiana, you would lose. But there's a lot of, I think, 50-50 or 40-60 games for Indiana. If they get one of the two, I think it could go their way. I definitely think they could beat a weakened, still a weakened Purdue team from the Brom exiting after 2022, albeit an improved one. Michigan State's still rebuilding. We don't know how Nebraska's going to be with a freshman quarterback. And then Northwestern, is that even much of a home field advantage at that little high school stadium they're playing at? Who really knows? And, Northwestern fans turn out to games, but Indiana on October 5th, I don't know if that really fills up. So that's my long-winded way of saying, Sean, there is a way for this team to get 6 games and potentially with 5 and 7 with shortage of bowl-eligible teams. I doubt Kurt Signetti, based on the guy we know who he is going to back down from getting an academic invite should that occur for Indiana. So I think it's definitely possible. If you ask me to pencil it in right now, I do think they make it to a bowl game. I think they win 3 of their non-conference games, and maybe they steal a game, whether it's at Northwestern, at Michigan State, or a home game after the bye week to versus Nebraska. I think it's possible.
All right, well, a brand new team, pretty much, a number of transfers coming in for the Hoosiers, so a number of question marks just 10 days out from when they start against Florida International. Now we'll go, Joe, to another team that should be a little bit more familiar to us in the Big Ten, especially those who watch a lot of Big Ten East football, and that is James Franklin's Penn State Nittany Lions. They've come so close, but so far, the last couple of years, I'll ask you this question, Joe, and then I'll sort of follow up. I got the schedule up. Penn State, with the expanded playoff, should be one of the most favored teams to just do what they've been doing, and then they'll be in the top 12. Do you think Franklin can get them over the hump this year?
Yes, and unlike Indiana, there is no gray area with what success is this year. And frankly, maybe even getting into the 12 team isn't enough. But the bare minimum for James Franklin, and it's not necessarily to keep his job, I don't want to be melodramatic, is to make the 12 team playoff. Period, point blank. This team, last year's team, was supposed to be the team that, I don't even want to say made the playoff, showed that they had made steps.
Well, they didn't. They got beat badly by Ohio State and Michigan.
Yeah. And Sean, one of James Franklin's most famous press conferences was in his fifth year at Penn State in 2018, after the 27-26 loss to Ohio State in the whiteout, where they led by 12 with 8 minutes left to go. He talked about how they went from a good team to a great team, and they were just short of being elite. They've been more than just short in the past 5 years since then. Last year, even at 10-3 and New Year's Six Bowl appearance, which is nothing to make light of, they disappointed. And, having that many offensive coordinators, I think it's been 6 in as many or 7 or 8 years. The only offensive coordinator who's hit at Penn State, Sean, is Joe Moorhead, who was with them for the Trace McSorley, Saquon Barkley teams and Gesicki teams. So that's the long-winded way of saying, Sean, Andy Koldenicki, the offensive coordinator from Kansas, he might be the most important coordinator in this conference, and I say even more so than Chip Kelly or Wick Martindale, especially for that fan base. A lot of hopes riding on him. Sean, I know you're going to ask me another question here, but based on the schedule, which we're going to go through in a second, they have to make the playoff with this.
Yeah, and they probably don't have to do much better than last year to do it. You lose. You see 2 teams ranked there. I would think one loss would certainly get them in, especially if it is to that Ohio State team, and Ohio State stays pretty solid. But Your first two Big Ten games are home. That'd be Illinois, UCLA. You do have a road non-conference game against a power, a Big 12 opponent in West Virginia. I think one loss certainly gets them into the college football playoff, and likely two probably does as well. And then you talk about whether they can make the Big Ten championship, and we will talk about that at the end of the episode. No more divisions anymore. It's just the top two teams. But you have to without much improvement, Penn State, again, should be able to get across the line. Any potential landmines? The Ohio State game is the Ohio State game, but any potential landmines that you can see the Nittany Lions slipping up in?
I think there are two, and one's very sneaky, and I don't mean that West Virginia is sneaky in the sense it's the first game of the year. They've been prepping for it for more than a month. One thing I will say, with Garrett Green and the two returning running backs from West Virginia, a returning offensive line, Morris, and I'm forgetting the other running back at West Virginia's last name. They have their leading rusher from 2022 and 2023, and Garrett Green, who is also a mobile threat. That's nothing to make light of, Sean. And this game kind of rings similar to their opener in 2022 at Purdue, albeit that was a Thursday night game. They struggled a lot in that game on defense. And one thing we just talked about Indiana, ironically, the coach they lost has landed on his feet at Penn State, replacing Manny Diaz as the defensive coordinator. I think Penn State kind of and James Franklin gets the benefit of the doubt on defense, and he's earned that. Penn State, say what you want, even say what you want about their defense in the bigger games. They've let up certain scores at the end. Their defense, I'll put it to you this way: I'd be hard pressed to find a reasonable Penn State fan who would even come close to blaming their defense for any of their shortcomings in the James Franklin era. So they've earned the benefit of the doubt there. But if their offense struggles out of the gate in that game and they somehow slip up, I think James Franklin goes from someone who's been, I think, respectably enough defended in the offseason after 2023 to somebody who could find himself on the hot seat if they lose to West Virginia, which I do not think they will. I think that game could be close, but there's a difference between a close win and a loss there. That is a magnitude shifter. And then just to finish up, Sean, at USC, at Wisconsin, Ohio State, I don't know what Washington's going to be, frankly.
That's a big stretch, though, those 3 or 4
stretch. They have to go, if they beat West Virginia, at very least they have to go 1 for 3. And I don't say that lightly. I think at USC, especially after that'll be your 4th straight game, USC is the most volatile team in college football, which we'll talk about later. We don't know how they're going to be. But either way, that's not going to be an easy game. And at Wisconsin, which has a great potential to be a hollow weekend night game, I do not know how comfortable I'd be if I was a Penn State fan. And those are two teams. We don't know what they're going to be. We'll find out soon enough with those teams. But those are two games that Penn State won't be looking forward to in October. And they definitely can't afford to lose all 3.
I'll ask you this, Joe, as the viewers can see. There's a bye week after the USC game and before the Wisconsin game. That Wisconsin game screams out landmine to me because you've got to think, at least some of the attention during the bye week is going to be put on Ohio State, and you're going on the road and you're not as sharp from the time off. I could see them slipping up at Wisconsin if they're looking over the shoulder to the next week in Ohio State. But like you said, that stretch is big, and if this Penn State team is really as good as we think, they could be undefeated hosting Ohio State on November the 2nd, and that would be an absolutely brilliant game. You can see there on the right side of the schedule here on ESPN, the tickets are already at $190 for that Ohio State game. And
those are going way up.
And the Purdue one a couple weeks later is just at $12. So already people are circling that one on their calendars. But Joe, let's move on to the next one because we do have to get through 7 more teams here. Mm-hmm. We're going to go to the Maryland Terrapins. Now, there's not a whole lot to say about Maryland's performance on the football side of things, really, since they joined the Big Ten off the top of my head. Now, where do you go from here if you're Maryland in this new look conference?
I think Mike Locksley was the most telling coach at Media Day because this is the first time I've ever heard a Mike Locksley team was going to be defensively based. That's like hearing a foreign language come out of his mouth. He might as well have spoken in Chinese because Mike Locksley, I mean, clearly an alleged mastermind behind the Bama 2018 offense. You can look up the Gaddis versus Locksley Twitter feud, who's funnily enough the offensive coordinator at Maryland now, to find out what I mean. But Sean, this is a schedule where I don't think there's a lot of opportunity for Maryland to advance. And here's what I mean. I know they get MJ Morris, the quarterback from NC State. The biggest knock on Maryland since joining this conference, Sean, is what's been their trademark win. Sure, I know they beat Michigan and Penn State in their first year in the conference, but those teams were combined like 12 and 13. That's not that impressive. And then you couple that in with all the times they've beaten ranked teams. It's been like a ranked Michigan State team in 2016 that finished 3-9. This is a Maryland team that I think has to do better than just making a bowl game, which, to Mike Locksley's credit, he's elevated the program. No one's questioning the job he's done. What they question is if there's more progression that's possible. And MJ Morris, I think he's a solid enough QB. He struggles turning the ball over kind of the way Talia did. But unlike Talia, he doesn't have the amazing playmaking ability that he did. So with that said, there's only 4 opportunities on this schedule, I think, to make a statement win, where that's USC, at Oregon, Iowa, and at Penn State. I truthfully do not see them winning one of those games as of today. I think that could change, but that's what Maryland has to do to show progress as a program.
And Joe, for me at least, I think they've got to get off to a decent start to even believe in themselves enough to compete in those games. Because as you said, all 4 of those games are towards the end of their schedule. They trip up early on, and who knows where where the season could go for Maryland. I think last place is definitely a possibility, and you know, like what would you suggest as a successful season? Like 4 wins, maybe 5. Is that a step in the right direction at least?
I think based on the turnover they've had, and they still have a solid O line, solid running game, and and one and a decent tight end package. One thing I don't love, Sean, is I think, like Penn State, their season and their narrative of the season comes to a head week 2 when they play Michigan State. If they lose that game at home to a upstart Michigan State team under Jonathan Smith, I think you're right. I think 4 to 5 wins after that does become a success, because a lot of those games, if they lose to Michigan State, aren't likely to go their favor. And even the more favorable ones, I think Rutgers is going to be improved. Iowa at home's no joke. Ultimate success shot is beating one of those 4 teams I mentioned, winning a top 25 game and showing that you could not only compete with the big boys, which they've done to their credit. Just look at the Michigan game last year and the Ohio State game. That you could win one of these games. And I think that's their dream goal, but realistic goal is probably get 6 wins and then win another bowl game. And then we're probably having the same discussion next year.
Yeah, they do start with UConn, which should be a victory, and then Michigan State at home. 2-0, I think would go a long way for the Terps in terms of believing in themselves for this season, because we get Virginia on the road and then FCS Villanova. I mean, and then at Indiana. 5-0 is not out of the question. It's really not, for how much we've been, ragging on Maryland and how they don't have much to look forward to. They could be 5-0 on October 11th against Northwestern. So we'll have to see what happens with the Terps. Now, Joe, we've got our first newcomer in the conference. This is the Oregon Ducks, who come over from the Pac-12. They bring over a team that's been very solid over the years, a number of impressive teams. Their schedule is up here. They will start their Big Ten season in familiar fashion on the road at former conference foes UCLA before getting into the thick of it with Michigan State, Ohio State, Purdue, Illinois. One of the 4 new kids on the block. What do you see Oregon bringing to the Big Ten this year?
Sean, in our lifetime, we've had plenty of new Big Ten conference members. Maryland, Rutgers, Nebraska, and then SEC is going to have Texas and OU. This is the first time the Big Ten's had a football team come in year 1 having serious national championship aspirations and favorability. I think they're the 3rd or 4th odds-on favorite to win it all. And I know Ohio State, who we'll talk about later, gets credit for the transfer portal class they hauled in, as they should. Oregon, I think, equally pulled a class, and maybe rankings wise, because of the sheer amount Ohio State had. They're not equated, but to me, I think it's kind of the same thing. Dylan Gabriel, Evan Stewart, Derek Harmon, and these are just three guys. Uh, those are the three best to me. I think everyone could argue about uh, who else is better and whatnot. But Sean, Oregon has a real chance to go 12-0.
And in terms of just making the Big Ten championship, Joe, they do play both Michigan and Ohio State. So if you think they could win one of those two, get the tiebreaker over whichever team they beat, then you do think they have a good chance of maybe getting in that top two and getting, across the line and a chance to play for a conference title in year one. They don't have Oregon State on the road. Maybe you trip up there, but you got Boise State and Idaho. They should be rolling through the non-conference part of their season. And then in terms of, games, they're better than every team here except for the two teams with numbers for sure. And they still might even be better than Ohio State and Michigan. So I can see them rolling through this schedule, quite honestly, and potentially even running the table and winning this conference in year one.
Yeah, Sean, and one more thing I want to mention. I didn't mention Jabbar Muhammad, the standout quarterback from Washington last year, who I think is going to be even better with another year of play. And Sean, I want to call this out. I think the only game besides the two we highlighted that could be difficult in the same way is at Wisconsin late November. Perhaps that could provide trouble. But Oregon in the last 2 years, Sean, I'm going to be really honest, their worst enemy, and this is kind of, it's almost blasphemous to say, considering the guy who's made this amazing roster is the guy I'm going to criticize right now. It's Dan Lanning. I think in the two Washington games this year, he was clearly outclassed by Kalen DeBoer. And even the Washington game in 2022 that they lost at home, he was again outclassed by Kalen DeBoer. And everyone's going to call out the two fourth down decisions in both regular season games. But I think it's beyond that. I think Washington was more patient, and now Washington is a far cry of what they were, luckily for Oregon. But that's going to be scrutinized, and you got to believe in the Ohio State and Michigan game, Dan Lanning is going to be forced to make a call, whether it's fourth down, whether it's a play call, or whether it's a defensive package he'll put out there, because he is a defensive guru from his time at Georgia. What's going to happen? Do you think he's going to learn his lesson? And frankly, it's a rhetorical question because we're not going to know until those games. And, what defines success for Oregon in this schedule, Sean? I think it's pretty clear. I think you have to make it to Indianapolis year one with the sheer amount of talent you have, because this amount of talent and experience with Dylan Gabriel, the offensive line, the defensive line, they do not have a weak position. Now, there are weaker positions compared to others on the team. They do not have a real weakness. You're going to have to beat this team solidly, and you're not going to be able to get away with. You're not going to be beating them without your A performance. So I think with that said, Sean, 11-1 going to Indy, that's clear success for the Ducks year one in the regular season.
I would also say, in terms of the playoffs, Joe, that they should not be the road team in the first round of the college football playoff. I think you're either hosting that, round. Before the quarterfinals round, or wearing your home jerseys in the quarterfinal round, whichever bowl that it is at. So expectations high for the Ducks in year one. We're going to move on to another team, Joe, who will have high expectations, who we've talked about a couple times on other people's schedules so far, and that is the Ohio State Buckeyes. Ryan Day brings in an impressive, highly ranked transfer class, as you alluded to earlier. They get a new quarterback. They get a new running back. They've come up short the last couple of years. They're preseason ranked number 2. This Ohio State team should have eyes set on Indianapolis, the college football playoff, maybe a top 4 seed. Ohio State's got everything to look forward to this year.
Sean, I cannot remember a year, and I was talking about this when I've been in Columbus the past few months, where Ohio State truly felt natty or bust, because you could say that in the middle of a season after seeing your team play. This team has not played a regular season snap, and you're already getting that. And admittedly, to most Ohio State fans, Will Howard is a semi-upgrade or even the equivalent of Kyle McCord in overall ability. Now, people are going to scream that I dare compare a quarterback that went 11-1 to a guy who hasn't even won 10 games as a starter yet in a regular season. So, with all that said, Sean, Oregon got the best QB transfer in college football. Ohio State clearly got the best running back transfer in college football, Quinshon Judkins. The 1-2 punch with Travion Henderson while adding in Chip Kelly, which we've alluded to in the offseason, that's going to be, I don't think Chip Kelly will ever have, nor has he ever had that amount of toys in college. Clearly, the NFL, that's a different issue. But the creative play calling with freak freshman Jeremiah Smith, who's projected to be, and I think this is pretty unfair, but from everything I hear and everything you read, he's going to be one of the best freshman wide receivers, or should be one of the best freshman wide receivers this conference and league has ever seen. Emeka Ibuka is back. Jelani Thurman at tight end is projected to be a monster. This offense is weakness, Sean, is the offensive line and Will Howard. And the only reason I say weakness is those are the only people or units that could feasibly be bad in certain games. And then the defense is returning everyone. Denzel Burke, JT Tulamuluau, Jack Sawyer, with Jim Knowles back. Ohio State has no excuses to not be an excellent product on the field. Now, they have an excuse to not be 12-0, but to not be an excellent product on the field, there is zero way you could get out of that.
Yeah, Joe, they do have a loaded schedule, as those can see. They do host Iowa, they go on the road to Oregon, they go on the road to Penn State, and then they host Michigan on the final week, as they have for a number of years now. Joe, that, worst case scenario, like, could a 3-loss Ohio State team make the college football playoff? I don't think it's a 0% chance.
I think it's a close to 0% chance because the games they would have to lose would be all three of their ranked games, and I don't think beating Iowa at home would do that. But Sean, I don't ever think it would even come to that. I think Ryan Day,
they're not going to lose all three of them.
I think Ryan Day is one of the most over-criticized coaches in college football, saying that not ironically. He's lost 8 games in the 5 years he's been there. So anyone calling this guy a bad coach or a failure is pretty moronic by objective standards. Sean, success for Ohio State is pretty complex this year, but I'm going to simplify it. They have to beat Michigan. That is number one. There is no way an Ohio State fan will be happy if they do not beat Michigan. And the objective argument is, oh, well, if they lose to Michigan and win the Natty, they'll be happy. I'll be very clear. They will not lose to Michigan and win the national title. Those two things rarely happen, and they've never happened. I don't care what happened 2 years ago. Trust me, losing to Michigan for the 4th time in a row at home when you're an 11-point favorite in the preseason will not be accepted by anybody in the state of Ohio. And, Sean, even beating Michigan might not be enough. With this loaded roster, with these expectations, you have Urban Meyer and Jim Tressel, 2 Buckeye legends, coming out and saying this is the best Ohio State team, most talented Ohio State team ever before they've played a snap. I think the only acceptable way to not win a natty is to trounce Michigan and lose in Atlanta to Georgia. They cannot lose in Atlanta to any other team besides Georgia for Ohio State fans to say it was a successful season. Now, maybe they lose to Texas in the natty, and Ohio State fans are happy if they beat Michigan. I think based with this talent and the crazy amount of expectations right off the heels of their arch nemesis overpassing them since COVID and winning a natty, Ohio State has to win the national title unless they lose to Georgia and Atlanta. I think that's pretty clear.
They're certainly one of the favorites to do so. That number 2 next to their name to start the season is not for nothing. They're going to be a talented ball club, and they are going to get tested in the regular season, that's for sure. They do play Oregon on the road on the famous October 12th date that has been going around. That might be the best day in college football history, just looking at it now. Tons of good games on October the 12th. But, Joe, we're going to move on to the team near where we grew up and a relative newcomer to the Big Ten. That would be the Rutgers Scarlet Knights. Greg Schiano trying to get this team back to where he had them before he left the first time. Now, hasn't really done that since he's returned from the Buccaneers, among other jobs. But looking at this schedule, Joe, just one team with a number next to it. It's University of Southern California. Should be at least a little bit of an opportunity for Rutgers to take a step in the right direction this year.
Yeah, Sean, I don't want to compare Rutgers to Maryland at all. I know they came in the conference at the same time. I think Greg Schiano, 4 years into the job already. I think last year and winning the Pinstripe Bowl against Miami, albeit a weakened Miami team, did wonders. Rutgers getting to a bowl game in the new Big Ten during the reign of Chris Ash, I promise you that was not a given. And the fact they've done it twice, albeit one was an academic one, and that they've won a bowl game against a major program like Miami, I think Rutgers fans, maybe they're not packing the stadium the same way these other teams are, but the dedicated Rutgers fan is invested. And when I say USC is the most volatile team in the Big Ten, I think Rutgers' expectations, not by their fans, but by pundits around the nation, is pretty expansive. Their over-under is 6.5 wins. But there are people who think they could be, like Kirk Herbstreit coming out and saying they could be a contender for the college football playoff. That's a variation of expectations I've not seen ever with Rutgers, let alone since they've been in a major conference.
Well, they'd have to win some games that they shouldn't and have those teams then win some games that they shouldn't after that Rutgers beats them. But, you see a number of solid teams on there. Now, the first game we'll talk about after we go back to you, Joe, but finish your thought on Rutgers real quick.
Yeah, Sean. So expectation-wise, I don't know what the fine success is. I think bare minimum is clearly keep the bowl streak going to another bowl game. But this team starts out 3-0, especially if they beat a Virginia Tech team in Blacksburg.
They probably should.
Which they have a better chance than you think. Washington at home, Friday night at 8 o'clock. That becomes one of the bigger games in Rutgers football's recent history.
Hey, welcome to the Big Ten, Washington. Here you go. Rutgers, New Jersey on a Friday night. Washington's never played in that before. I promise you that. Then, you get the Nebraskas and Wisconsin, and you get the two California schools. You go to USC on a Friday night. That's not going to be fun for the Rutgers fans.
That's vile. 11 p.m.'s vile.
11 p.m. on Fox on Friday. If you're a Rutgers fan, too bad if you have anything on the 26th. Just sorry. And then you get the Minnesotas, the Marylands, the Illinois. There's a chance, Joe, that none of these teams are in the top 4 in the conference. And, you'd have to like your chances for Rutgers here to be in the top half of the conference, I think. Now, that's the middle of the pack is going to be pretty deep this year. There's going to be a lot of teams with, 3-4 Big Ten wins. But I think there's a way Rutgers get to 4-5 Big Ten wins and definitely maybe get there. Maybe I don't know if college football playoff is in the cards, but maybe to get ranked at some point this year.
I think that's in the cards, shut. And frankly, I think 8 regular season wins is something they haven't done, I think, even since 2013.
Yeah, you're going back to the Big East days, I think.
2012, 2013 is on the table because there's only 4 games I see right now where they're going to be favored to lose the week of the game. And that's maybe Washington, Nebraska, Wisconsin, USC. All these other games, maybe Michigan State, depending on how they do. 4 or 5 games where you're not favored, 8-4 is on the table. And if you steal, I don't think you're going to steal USC, but if you steal Wisconsin at home, maybe you catch Dylan Raiola on an off night the first Saturday of October. There's a reason Kirk Herbstreit said they could be a fringe playoff team. I do not believe that, to be very clear, but I don't think he's just speaking that from his area. So, Sean, I think this team could be anywhere 6 to 10 wins at absolute dream scenario, but I think the truth's in the middle at 7 or 8 wins in the regular season, which would be a massive success still for Rutgers.
Yeah, I think 8-4 and maybe 23rd ranked heading into a bowl is probably a really good scenario. Now we'll go on to that team that you mentioned, Joe, that Rutgers is playing in the final week of the season, and that is the Michigan State Spartans. Jonathan Smith comes over from Oregon State, a brand new era in Lansing for the Spartans on the football side, and What have you got here? They play 2, 3, and 9. It's gonna be a tough end of September, early October for the Spartans, but Jonathan Smith, pretty solid career, especially down the stretch there at Oregon State. What do you got for the Spartans this year?
I think eh, I think they're unlike a lot of teams. I think they're more similar to Indiana in the sense of new quarterback. But one thing Smith has over Signetti, he knows Aiden Childs. Albeit he didn't start for Oregon State. That was DJU last year. This is a guy he's recruited for a while. He's a guy that's tailor-made for his offense. He's a mobile quarterback. If you play the video game Not Related, he's very fun to play as. And I'm saying that as a Wolverine. Maybe I shouldn't have admitted that in public. But the combination of Childs, Nate Carter, Jack Velling, the star tight end from Oregon State as well. I think that's really interesting. You bring back Montori Foster. There are some pieces on the offense that could make it pretty exciting, especially with a mobile quarterback, which means all bets are off. Now, I do think the defensive depth with new defensive coordinator Joe Rossi, I think that's probably their biggest question. I think where they're going to be outmatched, especially in this Armageddon stretch from the 28th of September to when they play at Michigan, which might be a night game between Ohio State, Oregon, Iowa, Michigan. That might be Armageddon between their offensive and defensive line. I think at that point, your goal for those units is to stay healthy and not get blown off the ball every play, which is more than fine to happen in practically year zero of a rebuild from the disastrous end of the Mel Tucker era.
Hey, Joe, they frankly could play pretty solid through that month so, and be 0-4.
0-4 with significant, besides maybe Iowa, with significant margins of defeat.
Yeah, I think you'll see, especially in those first two games, he's not going to be leaving the starters out there for very long. Now, that stinks to think about before a game's been played, but you could be 4-0 to start. You start your Big Ten season with Maryland, so you could be 1-0, and then after that it becomes damage limitation. Maybe you can pick off one of them, but highly unlikely. And then looking at the last 4 games of their season, you could see them winning all 4 of those. So it's going to be a very interesting season for Michigan State. Now, if they're, let's say, 3-5, do they really, do they have too many injuries to really attack those last 4 games? I think when the final whistle blows at the Big House on the 26th, I think we'll know a lot more about where Michigan State is as a program, like you said, in year one. Now, you'd love to say they can get 6 wins, and I think they could, but it really just depends on how much that stretch takes out of them.
Yeah, Sean, and I think they're critical games for bowl eligibility, which if you haven't found out by now, I do think that's a very fair measure of success. And even at 5-7, if they pick off, it's not inexplicable they pick off Michigan. I say that with all seriousness based on the history of that rivalry. If they go 5-7 and pick off a game or go 6-6, I think most Spartan fans, and I'm in the area just as a reminder, would be more than happy with that. And then you have Childs back next year. Recruiting's a little slow at the beginning, but you could sell results off 6-6. And I do think Michigan State, I think Smith is a program builder. I do think the administration is patient with him.
Yeah, it might be slow. Slow.
It was a slow build at Oregon State, and ultimately the final product was very good at a program that, frankly, doesn't even hold a candle to Michigan State, who is a top 25, objectively a top 25 program in the country on any given year. So I think you definitely can't slip up against an FAU. You can't slip up against an Indiana at home if bowl eligibility is a possibility. I do think of all the games you're favored to win between FAU, Prairie View, you shouldn't even play that game, Indiana, Purdue. There's 4 games I think you're likely to win. You got to pick off 2 between at Illinois, Rutgers, at Maryland, and at BC. So those at Maryland, at BC games become very big for Michigan State's bowl eligibility. But if they do start 4-0, Sean, I think at that point, 2 wins, getting 2 more wins is more than possible, even with the Armageddon. Yeah. And then maybe you have different conversations in East Lansing if you start 4-0.
I think it's certainly possible now. Not really into ACC football, but BC is definitely a team that you can beat. And Maryland, as we already talked about, low expectations for them as well. So 4-0, not totally out of the question. Now, 4-4 will almost certainly follow a 4-0, but still 4-4 when you play Indiana. That's going to be a good spot, we think, for the Spartans. Now, Joe, we've got two teams left here today that we're going to talk about. It is the two teams that competed in the national championship a year ago. Both teams look wildly different than they did that night back in January. First, we're going to go to the runners-up. The second new team in the conference that we're talking about today, that is the Washington Huskies. Kalen DeBoer out the door to Alabama, and they get in Jedd Fisch from Arizona. Now, the pieces all kind of fell together for this perfect Washington season, while they really haven't been near that level in my memory. But they lose a number of good players. You'll see a number of Washington players playing on Sundays this year in the NFL. They come to the Big Ten. A rather light schedule to begin with. A little bit of a, gauntlet there in the middle. But a tough schedule for Washington in year one in the Big Ten.
Sean, I think we're going to compare a lot of Washington and Michigan these next few minutes. In terms of returning production, Washington has a slightly better or slightly similar grade to Michigan, but that should not deceive anyone. If you lose three of the best receivers Washington's ever had between Odunze, Polk, and McMillan, let alone a first-round quarterback and a head coach, that's a ginormous problem. You lose a Jabbar Muhammad, too, who was slated to come back. A lot of this season's going to ride on the brilliance of Jedd Fisch, which, again, is the reason he has this job, and the gunslinging ability of Will Rogers. He did struggle with turnovers toward the end at Miss State. I do think a lot of that was the unfortunate situation Miss State was in the last year with Zach Arnett. I do think Will Rogers with injuries was poorly judged, especially with the with the tragic death of Mike Leach, who I really think Will Rogers operated very well under. He was a very solid QB in the SEC, and everyone had that perspective until last year. I think it rides a lot on him. I do think success this year, Sean, I don't think it's bowl game. I think it's 7 wins. I think Washington is if they're not a blue blood, they're certainly the next tier of that. And a program like that doesn't strive to go 6-6. Now, they play 5 teams currently ranked in the top 25. And, you can challenge a game at Rutgers, challenge a game at Indiana as well. I do think, Sean, that 5-0 is not off the table at all. I think Washington State's going to be weakened. I know it's a rivalry game. They won't be up for that.
It's a 3:30 It's a noon kickoff game too over there, which that can't be. They can't be too happy about that.
No, on Peacock too, so that's just a joke. But there's a real possibility, Sean. They're 5-0, and if Michigan loses to Texas, which we'll talk about in a second here, they could be ranked, top 15, maybe even top 12 when they play Michigan in what's likely to be a night game. And, their season from there kind of could go in a lot of different directions if it doesn't go off the rails immediately there, which I don't foresee. The only game I see them losing early is at Rutgers before they go into that stretch. But, Sean, I think Jedd Fisch's play calling and whatnot, I think it's good they have this early cushion with the 3 cupcake games. Because Jedd Fisch at Michigan, funnily enough, in 2015, we were in a similar situation with him as our play caller. And one thing we didn't have was a light schedule at the beginning. The offense got better and better as the year got on. You saw that in Arizona with Fafita. And I do think Will Rogers is going to get better should he stay healthy. So I think Washington's going to be more prepared for this stretch at the end than you think. I do think 7 to 8 wins is a success, and that anything above that is certainly great. And, I'm going to say 7-8 wins with a caveat that you beat one of these top 25 teams, whether it's Michigan, Iowa, Penn State, Oregon. I do not think USC at home is going to be as big a challenge in November as one might think. They kind of do have their number as of late. So we will see about that.
Joe, when you talk about these teams, from the Pac-12 coming into the Big Ten, I don't see like a true gauntlet of Big Ten type teams in here. You have the Michigans and the Penn States who have professionals who've been at the top of this conference, and then you have the other 3 teams coming in with you, USC, UCLA, Oregon. You don't have Iowa is the only team that I would categorize as like gauntlet average Big Ten teams, like the Wisconsins, the Minnesotas, the Nebraskas. Those teams that could sneak into the top 25 probably will bounce in and out. Maybe Rutgers is that team this year, but those are the sorts of games that I see new teams slipping up on, like you know, these teams that are 500, maybe just over, and that's Big Ten football if you think about it. Unfortunately, and we talked about how terrible the Big Ten West was last year. I don't think they're really going to get caught up in all that. They're playing the other Pac-12 teams. They're playing Northwestern, Indiana. They're playing Penn State and Michigan, who are good teams, and they'll have to play very well to beat them. But I don't think they're going to get as much Big Ten football as maybe the other teams are.
Yeah, and ultimately, I do think part of what you said's overblown. And they play at Iowa at night or whatnot. You rarely see that. Like they're playing.
That game is what I mean, though. They're only getting one of those.
Yeah, there will be one of those. It might not happen as often as others might think, and I think we're on the same wavelength here, Sean, but it's going to happen at some point, which will be fascinating.
Well, yeah, next year and the year after, they'll get the Wisconsins and Nebraskas and Minnesotas and all that, but they don't really have that this year, so I think that might get them another win, to be honest with you. The fact that they don't have to go play Nebraska on a 15-degree day in December or November, and where you can't run the ball or kick the ball or where you can't throw the ball or kick the ball because it's so cold. But yeah, Washington, I think their season could go a lot of different ways with how much different it is from the team that went to the national championship game. Now, Joe, last but not least for today, your Michigan Wolverines. New coach, new quarterback, new defensive coordinator, whole new roster, pretty much. Take it away on Michigan going into this year, the defending champs.
It's funny, Sean, because we talk about whole new roster, and that's not even remotely wrong. Unlike a lot of these teams, the Michigan States, the Indianas, the Washingtons, and even Oregon to a certain extent, a lot of these guys that could contribute on this team, aside from a Jay Sean Barnum from Maryland, and maybe, an Amir Hall, one of the new corners, these are all guys that are program guys that sat behind one of the better offensive lines in the past 3 years, guys just waiting their turn. So these are guys very familiar with what Michigan does, and if you've heard guys like Joel Klatt, let alone some program insiders, the culture hasn't changed much, and I think that's partly propaganda in the sense that, head coach changes. Of course, Jim Harbaugh is different than Sharon Moore. But what Michigan's going to try to do on offense, their main idea, what they did with J.J. McCarthy, who was a top 10 pick, they still ran the ball as much as they possibly could. And you better believe without a top 10 pick quarterback, they will do that even more so. Defensively, everyone complains about, they think Wink Martindale's going to be too aggressive. I do think the comparison that a lot of Big Ten fans have, which is Wink Martindale, old, Don Brown, old, like to blitz a lot, they're the same, is a very lazy comparison to make, considering Wink Martindale is the architect of the Ravens and Michigan defense that have made those two teams among the top 3 defenses in the NFL or college football. So I think the team is going to ride the defense as much as possible. I do think the Michigan offensive line is going to take a step down from the elite it's been in the last 3 years. I do think it'll still be a good offensive line. How this team rides is going to be if the offense can just be good enough where you give the defense the chance to win the game. Because last year the offense was more than good enough and the defense won them plenty of games, especially the Ohio State and Alabama game at the end of the year. Sean, you want to walk me through the schedule?
Yeah, so we've got really, I think, the only marquee non-conference game that we've gone over so far, Joe, and that is Texas on the schedule for Michigan, as you said before, on Big Noon kickoff on September 7th. Now, that's a home game for Michigan or neutral?
Home game, yes. Home game at noon. Big Noon kickoff.
Yep, so hopefully Gus will be on the call for that one. Now, you have Fresno and Arkansas State sandwiching that Texas game. Now, hopefully those are victories for Michigan, because if they're not, then, well, everything that we're going to say is wrong. But in terms of Typical, USC, Washington, Oregon, you get 3 of the 4 new teams. You get Minnesota, Illinois, Michigan State. You get Ohio State to end the season, Joe. The game that's really looking out as really important to me now is November the 2nd against Oregon. You're playing 3 teams that are in the top 4 preseason. If you win one of those 3, 2-loss Michigan with a top win against Oregon, that might be enough to get you into the college football playoff. Now, I think if Michigan wants to do that, I think they got to beat Oregon on the 2nd, because they're certainly not going to be favored to beat Ohio State, and they're probably not going to be favored to beat Texas. So I think that Oregon game becomes really important if Michigan wants to go to the college football playoff again.
I agree, Sean. The only pushback I would ever have is the only reason the Texas game, which, by the way, we are 3.5-point dogs, as Michigan is 3.5-point dogs as we record this podcast. The only thing Michigan might have a saving grace on is Texas's starting running back. Unfortunately, C.J. Baxter, along with one of their third-string running backs, are done, will not be playing in that game, and hopefully they'll be back as soon as possible. With that said, Sean, Texas might have to rely a lot on the passing game, which, kind of like these other teams, Quinn Ewers comes back, but a whole new receiving core. All 5 of their top 5 pass catchers in terms of production are in the NFL right now. So Michigan might have a better chance than people think of that game. Ultimately, if you made me pick, I think Michigan does end up losing that game in like a 27-17 game where Texas dominates, but the Michigan defense saves the score from being absurd. I think the biggest game of the year, Sean, if they lose to Texas, becomes USC.
Yeah, you got to win that. Can't be 2-2.
No, USC we'll talk about on the next episode. USC opens against LSU. Should USC beat LSU or keep that competitive, no matter what happens, if Michigan loses to Texas, you cannot leave September 2-2 with 2 losses at home, with Oregon, a road game at Washington, who's going to have revenge on their mind, and Ohio State looming. That would be unacceptable. But if you define success for Michigan, Sean, what would it be?
Now, that's tough because so much is different. But I think retaining your spot at the top of the conference, whether, top 4 in the conference and a chance down the stretch to go to the college football playoff, I would say top 4 in the conference and a feasible chance when you step on the field against Oregon to make the college football playoff. I would think that's success.
Yeah, and Sean, I think Michigan fans could be a little more greedy. I think getting into the 12 team would define success. I do think a 9-3 season, even with losses to Texas, Oregon, Ohio State, would be a little disappointing, but I think it would.
But you'd still be like 15th ranked.
Yeah.
You'd still be real close.
Yeah. And Sean, you mentioned something earlier. Between Texas, Oregon, Ohio State, should you steal one of those games, and I only say steal because we're not favored in any of them as we talk right now, you could afford a loss at 9-3. Should it not be an egregious loss? Like, what I mean is if you beat Texas and then lose to Washington, Oregon, and Ohio State, a 9-3 team with a top 5 win against Texas, they make an interesting case, especially because with Michigan's defense, I'm going to say it right now, I do not think by score they get blown out. They might get dominated by Ohio State or Oregon, but I find it hard to believe they'll lose those games by more than 14, or even more than a score, which might factor into the committee room. This is the first time they're considering 12 teams. I do think that could be a factor should it come to that. So I think Michigan 9-3 with no bad losses and making it to the 12 team would be successful, and anything above that, I think the Michigan fan base would just be frankly, in kind of just lust and pure greed at that stage. Saying that as a Michigan fan myself.
Yeah, like luckily for Coach Sharon Moore, you won the national title last year. So if you're not like elite this year, probably okay. And now I do think you still want to, what I say, top 4 in the conference, retain your spot at the top of the sport. And if a 9-3 season where you just miss out on the college football playoff is your down year, that's a pretty good down year. We've seen teams make the college football playoff and really fall off, come out of the rankings like Clemson did. I think if Michigan can have a legit chance down the stretch to make the playoff, I think that'll be a pretty good season.
Yeah, Sean, one last thing I want to mention in terms of clearly this team, top to bottom, is not as talented as last year's. One thing I
The
think
last
that's
year's team
important.
crushed everybody, so
Yeah. One thing I think that's important, though, is Michigan has more potential first rounders on this team than last year by far. Between Mason Graham, Will Johnson, two guys that are consensus top 10 picks as of today. Then you factor in Colston Loveland, who might be the first tight end off the board. Kenneth Grant, Derek Moore, Donovan Edwards, should he really perform to his full potential. Michigan is more top heavy than people are giving them credit for. Should they figure out the quarterback situation between Alex Orji and, as it looks today, Davis Warren, if they factor in the two QB system, whatever they do, all the quarterback has to do is not turn the ball over and make a few hit the turkey plays on third down,
they'll be in the game.
and you'll be in the game. And frankly, should they do that, they'll get at least 9 wins.
So Michigan, I think 4 of the teams that we talked about today, Joe, want to make the college football playoff this year. And there's going to be more tomorrow, too. Maybe not as many, because we're talking about the old Big Ten West teams. But that's it for our Big Ten East plus Oregon and Washington preview. Even though we keep saying Big Ten East, there is no divisions anymore. The top 2 teams at the end of the season will make it to the Big Ten championship. Now, tiebreakers are likely to come into effect, and teams might not have played each other, so that's a whole different thing that we might be able to do a whole episode on, Joe, if it gets a little boring in the middle of the season. But that's all we have for you today, just under an hour, a little longer than we wanted, but still, that's okay. We will come back to you later with the other 9 teams in the Big Ten. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.